It was a typical Thursday. I was at work, finalizing reports, when the phone rang. I glanced at the display and saw the name of my daughter's school. Immediately, my stomach dropped. I answered quickly, and on the other end, a cold voice said, "Your daughter fainted in the playground, but according to the principal, her parents refused to pick her up." I froze. "What do you mean?" I asked, completely confused. "I'm her mother. I'm taking the call now." The operator hesitated, then said they were trying to contact another number listed as the primary contact, but no one answered. It was as if I'd been erased from my own daughter's life. I ran out of the office without even grabbing my purse. As I drove, my heart felt like a ticking time bomb in my chest. I thought about everything that could have happened. Had she been hurt? Had she fainted from some medical condition? Was she short of breath? Was it hot? 1,000 questions were screaming in my mind, but no answers. And most of all, that sentence from the principal kept repeating over and over. Her parents didn't want to pick her up. When I got to school, I ran in. I walked straight past reception and went to the nurse's office. I found my daughter lying on a stretcher, pale, with her eyes closed. I almost didn't recognize her. The nurse looked surprised when she saw me and said, "Oh, you're the mother." I could only say, "Yes." "And what did they do to her?" My voice was shaky but filled with anger. It was at that moment that the principal appeared in the doorway. Hands in his pockets, he said coldly, "We waited a long time, but none of the parents wanted to come. We did what we could." I burst out, "I'm the mother! No one told me!" He looked away. In that instant, I knew something was very wrong. It wasn't just neglect. It was negligence. Share this story to reach further. Subscribe to the channel. Share this video on WhatsApp. And leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. I'll be very happy to read each comment. My maternal instincts were already on high alert. I scooped my daughter up against protocol and told her we were going straight to the hospital. I wasn't going to wait for anyone else. I wasn't going to hear any more excuses. This wasn't just about fainting. It was about a breach of trust, and I was going to find out how far it went. On the way to the hospital, my daughter woke up. Her eyes were heavy, and she could barely speak. She only whispered, "Mommy," in a whisper. It broke my heart. I took her hand and told her it was okay now, that I was there, but inside I was shaking. I needed to understand what had happened, and why no one had called me. At the emergency room, she was seen immediately. The tests began, and as they did, the doctors asked me questions. Does she have a history of seizures, heart problems, allergies? I said no, that nothing like that had ever happened before. They suspected low blood pressure or exhaustion, but something in my daughter's eyes said more. As the IV dripped in, she began to relax. I stayed by her side the entire time. Then, softly, she whispered, "I asked for you, Mommy," but no one heard. It tore me apart. My daughter there, alone, scared, and ignored. How could a child be left unconscious and treated like a nuisance? I returned to school the next day, medical report in hand and fury in my chest. I demanded a formal explanation. The receptionist said they didn't have my number registered as their primary contact, and that the emergency system was undergoing maintenance that day. The principal refused to answer me. It was as if they were trying to erase everything, pretend nothing had happened. I began to suspect the problem was bigger than it seemed. Something about that story didn't add up. Why would the principal say the parents didn't want to pick her up? Why had my name disappeared from the registry? And why was the school trying to pass it all off as a simple system error? I knew I needed to dig deeper, and I was willing to go all the way. I returned home determined to understand where my name had disappeared from. I pulled out all the old school documents, enrollment forms, authorizations, printed emails. My name was there as the primary contact on every version. There was no room for error. I'd been the only registered guardian since kindergarten. So, who changed that? The next day, I requested a formal meeting with the coordinator. I arrived with the papers in hand. The vice principal tried to calm me down, saying the system had recently migrated and some records had been accidentally deleted. But it was a lie. The old files were still there. Only my name was gone. I asked if they had made any manual changes. She hesitated before answering. Then she said, "We don't have easy access to that history." That confirmed my suspicions. Someone had deliberately erased it, and that someone probably had something to hide. I looked back into the woman's eyes and asked firmly, "Who was it?" She looked away, saying she'd check. but I already knew. They were hiding something. On the way out, a younger staff member took me aside. She glanced back, checking she wasn't being observed, and whispered, "You didn't hear this from me, but there was a strange meeting last week. The principal ordered a review of priority student records." I asked what that meant. She simply said, "Something's wrong here. Very wrong." I went home with a tightness in my chest. Everything was starting to fall into place in a frightening way. My daughter's fall, the disappearance of my name, the principal's coldness. It wasn't carelessness. It was intentional. And behind that intention, there was a secret someone wanted to keep buried, but now it was personal, and I was going to unearth it all. It was like being in a maze, but I could already smell the exit. And I knew that, at the center of it, there was a truth no one wanted me to see. The following week, I started talking to other parents. I called them one by one, carefully. I asked how their children were doing, if anyone had been sick, if they had been called correctly by the school, and little by little, the stories began to emerge. 2 mothers said their children had also reported fainting, but the school hadn't notified them. One of them said that, weeks earlier, her son complained of dizziness. He was taken to the nurse's office and stayed there until the end of class, alone. When she found out, the school said it was nothing serious. Another mother said she received a strange phone call, with a man saying it was not necessary to go there. I started writing everything down. Something systematic was happening. I created an online group with these mothers. Within a few days, we had almost 20 of them, and the stories were repeated, with slight variations. Always a feeling of unease, always a failure to contact those responsible, always an attempt to stifle. It was as if the school was trying to hide a series of incidents. But why? What were they trying to protect? That's when one of the mothers raised a hypothesis. What if it was something in their diet, or their sun exposure times, or even some chemical used in cleaning? No one knew for sure, but everyone began to suspect the school knew more than it was letting on. And if it wasn't saying, it was because admitting it meant facing consequences. At that point, fear mixed with indignation. We felt our children were at risk, and that for too long, we had trusted too much in those who only wanted to protect their own reputations. The feeling of helplessness began to turn into strength, because now, it wasn't just my voice anymore. There were many, and together we were going to make noise, And in the midst of all this, my daughter, who had previously cried silently, began to ask me, "Mommy, will they listen to us now?" And I promised, looking into her eyes, "Yes, they will, daughter, and no one will ignore you anymore." That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my daughter lying on that stretcher, alone. The scene replayed in my mind like an endless nightmare. I grabbed my phone and opened the mother's group. I wrote a direct message. "The school is covering something up. We have to take official action. Tomorrow, I want to be at the principal's door with whoever can go." Responses soon began to pour in. One mother responded with, "We're in this together." Another said she was already gathering documents and screenshots of conversations with the school. Within hours, we had enough reports to file a class action lawsuit. For the first time, I felt there was a real chance for change. But we knew the road would be difficult. We would face powerful people. The next morning, I arrived early. I was joined by 7 mothers, folders in hand, their expressions exhausted and courageous. We requested a meeting with the school board. They tried to push us to another day, but we refused. We persisted until we were heard. The meeting took place in a stuffy room, with tense faces on both sides of the table. We showed the reports, the documents, the recordings. We demanded explanations. The principal said he had no knowledge of these cases. One of the mothers pounded the table. "Then either you're negligent or you're lying." The silence that followed was deafening. The tension was so thick it was palpable. The truth was hanging from the ceiling, waiting to fall. The meeting ended with vague promises. "We'll investigate," they said. But we knew it wasn't enough. We left angrier than when we arrived, but also more united. On the sidewalk, a mother pulled me by the arm and said, "Let's go to the media. If they want silence, they'll get the opposite." And I knew this was the turning point, the time to take this beyond the school walls. It was there that I stopped being just a mother. I became a shield, a spokesperson, a voice for someone who was never heard. And for my daughter, I would go all the way. 2 days after the meeting, I received a notification from the school. An official statement claimed that all safety measures were being reviewed, and that No breaches in protocols were identified. It was a public statement sent to all parents. They were trying to clean up the image as if nothing had happened. A low blow. The mothers in the group were outraged. "Are they calling us liars?" one of them asked. We decided to record short videos telling our stories. No exaggerations, just the truth, with documents in hand. We posted them on social media with the hashtag #ItWasNotAMistake. In less than 24 hours, views exploded, and the local press started looking for us. That same day, reporters showed up in front of the school. The principal tried to block them, ordering the gates to be closed. A teacher was seen trying to hide boxes of documents in a van. Someone filmed the whole thing. The pressure increased by the hour. It was as if we were digging through a rotten wall that the school had been trying to whitewash for years. I received an anonymous call. The voice belonged to an employee who didn't want to be identified. She said, "They know they made a mistake, but they're covering their tracks before the parents find out." That left me breathless. Had they hidden other, more serious cases? Was my daughter's fainting spell just the first one to be noticed because someone finally paid attention? That same night, my daughter hugged me on the couch and said, "Mommy, I saw a boy faint before me, but no one did anything." My world stopped for a second. It was true. The children already knew. They had seen, heard, but no one ever asked them. And the school chose silence. Now, it was our turn to choose to scream. And this time, we weren't going to stop until everyone heard it. That week, the school made headlines. The story spread to regional newspapers and soon made it to television. The school board was pressured to issue a public explanation, but instead, they released a new statement, this time accusing a group of parents of spreading misinformation based on assumptions. My name was in the mix. It was an attempt to silence everyone, but the effect was the opposite. I received over 100 messages in 2 days. They were from parents, former students, even former employees. Everyone had stories to tell. Negligence, abuse ignored, sick children sent back to class due to a lack of a nurse's station. One former employee said he was fired after reporting the use of toxic chemicals in the cleaning. We went to see him in person, a simple man with a heavy gaze. He showed us photos, documents, and even emails he'd exchanged with the school administration. One of them clearly stated, "We can't create panic among the parents. Resolve this internally." That was confirmation of everything. They knew, and they were hiding it, including the fainting spells, which had been happening for over a year. At that point, our fight turned into a full-blown war operation. Lawyers offered to help. We created a dossier of evidence. We gathered videos, testimonies, and medical reports. Everything was recorded, documented, and ready to be used. And even though we were afraid, even though we faced veiled threats, we didn't back down, because what was at stake were lives too small to defend themselves. My daughter, even without understanding everything, began to recover. She was eating better, sleeping more peacefully. But one day, she looked me in the eyes and said, "Mommy, thank you for not letting them forget me." And in that moment, I knew that no matter how great the pain, it wouldn't be in vain, because we were breaking the cycle. And the school now bled, not by our hands, but by the truths they had hidden for too long. Among the many reports we received, one stood out. It was from a woman named Grace, the mother of a former student now in high school. She said her son fainted at the same school 3 years ago, and that she received the same strange call. "It's okay, you don't need to come." But the boy suffered after effects, recurrent seizures, to this day, unexplained. Grace came to our group with tears in her eyes. She said she tried to speak up at the time, but no one listened, that she was treated like a hysterical mother, and that, after insisting, her son was transferred. But the school never admitted anything. She kept the reports, the emails, the medical protocols. I was waiting for the right moment to speak up, and now, she was no longer alone. When we read her son's history, we nearly fainted. The description of the episode was identical to my daughter's. Same time of day, same location, the playground, same reactions, same school behavior. It was a pattern, a criminal pattern, and that changed everything, because now we had what the press called a repeat case. We took the report to the prosecutor's office along with all the others. An official inquiry was opened. Investigators began going undercover at the school, and the eyes of the town were on it. The school tried to resist, tried to manipulate, but their every move was now being filmed, every excuse dismantled in public. The castle was beginning to crumble. My daughter, watching the news on TV one day, asked, "Are the other kids better off now?" And I smiled. Because they are. Because when the truth comes out, it heals much more than our pain. It heals silence. It heals generations. And that fainting spell the school tried to hide became the beginning of the change no one could stop. The media pressure became unbearable for the school. One rainy morning, we received the news. The principal had resigned. There was no press conference, no apology, just a vague letter stating that administrative errors occurred. But we knew it was much more than a mistake. It was an omission, and the resignation wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of the collapse. Days later, new evidence surfaced. Internal documents showed that the schoolyard had been substandard since 2019. There were reports calling for more shade and more hydration for students, especially on hot days. Nothing was done. An environmental inspector had already warned of the risk of heat stroke. The school ignored it, and we paid the price with our children. An emergency committee of parents and experts was created to reevaluate the structure, but the damage was done. Parents began pulling their children out of school en masse. Teachers resigned. An eerie silence fell over the place. Where once there had been the sound of recess, now only hurried footsteps and slamming doors remained. The facade fell, and everyone saw it. Meanwhile, my phone was ringing off the hook. Reporters, prosecutors, mothers from other states were all asking for help reporting similar cases. What began as a silent distress call was now a movement, and amidst this chaos, my daughter was smiling again. She, who had once been unconscious on the ground in a schoolyard, was now a symbol of courage for many others. One day, while we were cleaning up toys, she looked at me and said, "Mommy, what happens now?" I held her hands and replied, "Now we start over and build a better place for you and for everyone." Because every tear we shed was not in vain. Every closed door opened a bigger one, and justice began to take shape. The school collapsed. But in the rubble's place, something new began to emerge. 3 months after the investigation began, the inquiry was concluded. The prosecutor charged 4 members of the board with gross negligence and failure to provide assistance. It was like taking a deep breath for the first time in a long time. Not for revenge, but for justice. For all the children ignored. For all the parents silenced. For my daughter. I received the news sitting on the porch, my phone trembling in my hands. I read each name in the complaint, as if reading a final chapter. I didn't cry. I just closed my eyes and breathed. It wasn't relief. It was dignity. Because when the system fails, the truth must scream until someone hears it. And now, finally, someone listened and acted. Families who participated in the struggle were called to testify. The media followed every step. And there, in front of the cameras, we were no longer just outraged parents. We were survivors of a system that had nearly swallowed our children. But now it was being forcibly reformed, and that was more powerful than any punishment. At the last public hearing, I was invited to speak. I stepped onto the small stage with a heavy heart. I spoke about my daughter, about the day she fell, about the principal's cruel remark. I recounted what no statistics show, the desperation of a mother who wasn't called when it mattered most. And in the end, I said firmly, omission will no longer be accepted as policy. The audience gave a standing ovation, not for me, but for everything we'd achieved together. It was the sound of a cycle ending and a new one beginning. My daughter, in the audience, smiled shyly. She didn't know the magnitude of the revolution she'd started with that fainting spell, but I knew, and now the world knew too. She fell in the courtyard, but we got up, and no one will knock us down again. With justice underway and the school nearly closed, the city began to breathe again. But inside the house, the wound still burned. My daughter was better, but there were still moments of silence, of withdrawal. Sometimes she would look at the ground as if she were still in that courtyard, with the world around her ignoring her pain. It was an invisible scar. We started attending sessions with a child therapist. The therapist used games and drawings to help her express herself. And it was during one of these moments that Ellie drew herself lying on the floor, while several people walked past her, faceless, non-stop. It destroyed me inside. Because now, in the form of art, she screamed everything she'd swallowed. As the meetings progressed, something beautiful began to emerge. Ellie drew a bridge, a tree, a bench with 2 people talking. It was as if she were rebuilding her inner security, piece by piece. Each sentence she uttered held a lesson, and each silence taught more than any words. One day she asked me, "If I fall again, will you come?" And I answered without thinking, "Before you even hit the ground, I'll be running." She smiled. That small smile, filled with confidence, was worth more than any court victory. Because now she knew. She knew that her voice matters, that the world needs to hear from children before they break. And if that pain ever returns, because trauma always leaves traces, I'll be here. Not as a perfect mother, but as a shelter, a radar, a beacon. Because no child deserves to fall alone, and no adult has the right to pretend they didn't see it. I learned that the hard way, but I learned it. Now, my daughter carries a scar, but she also carries armor. After the trial ended, our story reached places I never imagined. I received invitations to tell our story at universities, seminars, and even child protection NGOs. My voice trembled the first few times. But remembering what Ellie experienced kept me going, because now, every word could prevent another fall. At one of these lectures, a professor stood up and said, "I once ignored a student, and to this day, I regret it." She wept in front of everyone, and I saw the ripple effect of truth. Our story wasn't just an accusation, it was a mirror, and many people, upon hearing it, began to see the mistakes they'd rather forget. This was more transformative than any headline. We created a booklet highlighting signs of institutional neglect. We distributed it to schools, child welfare agencies, and support centers. Over 50,000 downloads were received in 2 months. I received messages from mothers in other countries saying they'd started paying more attention to their children. My daughter's fall became an international wake-up call, and that alone was worth every scar. Ellie now attends a different school, a smaller, more human one. She has friends, laughs loudly, and is part of a theater group. And at performances, she's always the most focused, as if by performing, she relives the pain, but also the victories. Seeing her standing on stage, with that light in her eyes, is confirmation that new beginnings exist, even when everything seems to have fallen apart. The other day, she told me, "I want to write a book when I grow up, about children no one listens to." I held back tears and just said, "Right, daughter. The world needs these stories." Because that's how it all began, with an ignored story, and that's how everything changed, when someone finally stopped to listen, and the sound of that impact is still echoing. Time has passed, but the memory of that day still lives on inside, sometimes in a smell, other times in a sudden silence in the house. It's impossible to erase what happened, but the pain has given way to something greater, purpose. Today, every time I see my daughter running in the yard, I know we won a silent war that almost no one saw. The emotional scar is still there, but now it doesn't hurt like it used to. It teaches. It reminds us of where we came from, what we faced, and who we chose to be after the fall. I could have let it go, accepted the apology, trusted their version, but no, I chose to listen to my instincts. I chose to be uncomfortable. I chose not to forget. And that's why I walk with my head held high today. Because I learned, the hard way, that schools are sacred. They can't just be walls and chalkboards. They must be shelter, respect, and care. Every child who steps foot there carries a world within them. And if they fall, they need hands to lift them up. Not bureaucracy, not silence. My daughter once said, "Mommy, all this happened for a reason, right?" And I replied, "Yes, daughter, so that other children don't have to go through what you went through." She smiled, and she left, backpack on her back, as if carrying not only books, but history. And I stood there, watching, tired, but at peace. We still have a lot to fight for, but now we have a voice, and we have each other. Because the biggest mistake we can make is thinking we're alone. We're not. Not anymore. And if a child falls again, may they find a world ready to catch them. Because if not for them, then for whom? Today, my daughter is more than a survivor. She's an inspiration. When you walk into a room, people listen. Not because you speak loudly, but because you carry a story that was nearly stifled by protocols and excuses. But it survived. It grew, and it became a shield for other small, fragile, and urgent voices. She wrote an essay the other day. The topic was, "The Day That Changed My Life." She talked about fainting, about the playground, about the principal's words, but she ended by saying, "Today, I know my mother saved me, but she also saved other children, and I want to do the same one day." I read it with tears in my eyes, because I understood that it was all worth it, not because of suffering, but because of transformation. Because when pain finds purpose, it becomes strength. And it is this strength that drives everything now. We transformed grief into struggle, silence into speech, fear into courage, and most importantly, we made noise where before there was only indifference. And no one will be able to silence that anymore. The school where it all happened has been revamped. New management, new protocols, more psychologists, more transparency. It's still not perfect. Nothing is. But now it has watchful eyes. It has listening ears. It has vigilant mothers. It has children who know they can say no. They can ask for help, and that someone will listen. Finally. And what about me? I carry on. With scars, yes, but also with pride. Because I went all the way for her, and for all those yet to come. Because I will never again leave an unconscious child alone, with a lie told behind a cold table. If this story touched you, share it with someone. It could be a mother, a father, a teacher. You never know who needs to hear this right now. Subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and leave a comment about where you're listening from. I'll read each one with an open heart. And remember, every child deserves to be heard. Every. Always.